Okay, everybody, so it looks like everybody's here, so I'm going to go ahead and get started a few minutes early. And just wanted to make a couple announcements before we get started. One is that this webinar is going to be recorded and archived. There were a lot of people that couldn't join us today, so I'm going to record this for their benefit, and what I'll do is I'll put it up on YouTube after the training, and then once I have that link, I'll send it out to anybody that's interested. And you can listen to this at your convenience later if you want to. Secondly, I worked it out with Ray Sabula at Cornell a while back that you guys can get credit for any time you spend attending any of the webinars that I do. So you can actually log this webinar as part of your continuing education credits with Cornell. You may be aware that you have to have, I believe it's 60 credits within 5 years, continuing education credits. So you can get credit for your attendance today. And you would log this webinar into your continuing education portal. You would just put in my name, the name of the session, which is Temporary Assistance for Needy Families, the date, and the duration, which will be about an hour. If you have any questions about how to log in those credits, you can email his assistant, Michelle Elvord, at msa224@cornell.edu, and she can kind of walk you through the process of what it would involve to log in your credits. There might be a few of you on the line that have not completed your full credentials yet. I know there were a few of you that have passed your exam but have not completed your case study and are not yet fully credentialed. So you would not actually have access to the portal yet. But for those of you that have your credentials and have the portal access, you can go ahead and log in those credits. So what I'm going to do today is just go over the handout that I sent around late last week, and I'll do that first, and then I'll give you an opportunity to ask any questions that you may have at the end. Today's webinar is on Temporary Assistance for Needy Families, or TANF, and this is part of an ongoing series of state-specific benefits that I'm going to be doing throughout the spring, summer, and early fall. I wanted to do this because I've done a lot of webinars in the past regarding federal benefits, SSI, SSD, and work incentives, but you're also going to have times where you run into clients that have state-specific benefits too that might have questions about how work activity would impact those benefits. So it's not just the federal ones that you should be aware of. You should at least know the basics of the state-specific benefits in case anybody comes to you that has questions like that, so you can at least know the basics and know where to refer them for further information. So I just want to start out by talking about what is TANF. And the TANF program is a federal and state-funded program that provides grant assistance to eligible households to meet their everyday basic needs. And basically, it's Virginia's form of welfare program. Usually people that are on TANF have little or no other source of support, and that's why they qualify for the TANF grant. Now, in the referrals that you guys get from DARS, it's very unlikely that you're probably going to run into a client that has TANF, because usually by the time that those clients come to us and they're referred to you for Work World or any other work incentive services, they've already had some sort of other income like Social Security, Disability, or SSI, and those benefits have likely knocked TANF eligibility out. So it's unlikely that you're going to see TANF referrals coming from DARS, but you may run into this in dealings with clients that aren't DARS referrals that may receive TANF benefits. So who's eligible for TANF? There's both financial and non-financial criteria. If the TANF household includes a child, the child has to fall into one of these two groups. They either have to be under the age of 18, so in other words, a minor, or if they're over 18, they can still be considered part of the TANF household until they're 19, if they're still in school and they're expected to graduate by the time they turn 19. So the household has to have either minor children in it or children over 18 but not yet 19 who are still in school in order for them to be considered part of the household. That doesn't necessarily mean that the household has to have children in it. Households without children can also qualify for the TANF grant if they meet all the criteria, but it would just mean that the child wouldn't be part of the assistance unit if they don't meet those criteria. And I'll kind of go over what the assistance units entail in just a minute. The children must also live in the home of a parent or relative that can be either a blood relative or by adoption. And all household members applying for TANF have to be either legal citizens of the United States or an alien that's here legally and a resident of Virginia. So when a person applies for TANF benefits, DSS is going to require them to provide some sort of documentation showing that they're a Virginia resident, like a driver's license or a bill with a mailing address on it, a voter registration card. Anything that shows their Virginia residency would suffice for that requirement. And then the income cannot have, or the household cannot have income that exceeds a certain limit. And it depends on where the client lives and how many people are in the household to determine what that income limit is. And I've given you an example down below. I took this from the Virginia Temporary for Needy Assistance Manual, and this is an example of a household of three. In a household of three, if somebody lives in a rural area, their accountable income from all sources can't exceed $554 a month. And a rural area would be like an area that I live in, for example. I live in Nottoway County. I'm about an hour and 15 minutes southwest of Richmond. Very rural area, not a whole lot going on. If somebody lived in an area like I live in and was a household of three, they would not qualify for any TANF if their countable income is more than $554 a month. In an urban area like Richmond, Chesterfield, places like that, that's more city-like, the grant is a little bit higher because the cost of living is higher in those areas. So a family of three could not have a countable income of $607 a month or more. And in Northern Virginia, because the cost of living is so much higher than both rural and urban areas, the family is allowed a countable income of $738 a month to still qualify for some TANF assistance. And I didn't put all of the income chart on here, but I did provide you a link to the income chart. If you click on that, that'll bring up the Virginia TANF manual, and that'll give you the income limits for each household size. The more people in the household, the more income that the household is allowed to have and still qualify for some assistance. And I'll go through how the Department of Social Services counts income for the purposes of calculating the TANF grant in a minute. Not all income counts when the person applies. So how does one apply for TANF assistance? There are a few different ways that a person can do that. The easiest way is to apply online via Common Help. That's an online application that the person can complete and have their information stored electronically and sent to social services. And I've given you a link to the Common Help within the document. It's commonhelp.virginia.gov/access. And then if a client can either not use the website or maybe they don't have internet access, they still have the option of completing a paper form. And I've also given you a link to the paper form that can be found at dss.virginia.gov in their forms section. I'm not going to take the time to go through the application just for the sake of time, but those are the ways that the person can apply, and those are how you can find the applications if you ever have a client who's interested in applying for services. I wanted to talk to you a little bit about how to calculate the income for the TANF grant. Like I said a minute ago, not all income that the household receives counts when DSS looks at if somebody's eligible for TANF. I gave you some common examples of what they don't count in terms of income. They don't count the value of any SNAP or food stamp benefits the household receives. Education grants and loans, including VR assistance, is also excluded. So if somebody has like a Pell Grant to help with tuition, or maybe they're working with DARS and DARS is sponsoring them for school, the value of all that assistance is excluded. SSI benefits. If a household member is on SSI, the amount of the SSI that the client receives is not part of the income calculation when calculating the TANF grant for the household. Income tax refunds are also excluded, so if the household gets a tax return at the end of the year, social services will not count that as income in the month that the household applies. Fuel cost assistance, if they get any help paying fuel costs, like through the HEAP program, the value of that assistance is not counted either. That's another needs-based program. Rental subsidy, Section 8, if they get a housing subsidy to pay for the housing costs, the value of the housing subsidy is also excluded. And earned income of the child in a household who is a student up to age 18 or 19 if they're still in school. It's kind of like the student earned income exclusion in a way for SSI, except, the SEIE goes up to 22. But in this case, social services will allow them to exclude the income of any child in the household who is a student between the ages of 18 or up to 19 if still in school. And then there's a standard deduction on earned income that applies to earned income, and this depends on the household size. The more people that are in the assistance unit, that I'll talk more about in a minute, the more of earned income is allowed to be deducted off the top when determining the countable income for the TANF grant. So, for example, if you have an applicant with a household size of between 1 and 3, social services will deduct the first $155 of their earned income per month that they don't count in determining the TANF grant. And then the exclusion amount increases with additional members of the household. So the more members of the household that qualify for TANF, the more is excluded right off the top. And then social services also allows for an additional 20% of the remaining earned income. After deducting any income received by students, 20% of the total income for the household is also excluded for the purposes of determining the TANF grant. And what I've done here is I've given you an example of how social services would calculate that grant based on household size. So the handout just says the maximum grant payable to an eligible household is dependent upon the household size and location of the household. As with the countable income limit, as I told you, the rural areas aren't allowed to make as much money and still qualify for assistance, whereas people in the urban areas in Northern Virginia can make a little bit more in countable income and still qualify for TANF. Same is true for the maximum amount of TANF assistance. In rural areas, because the cost of living is lower, the TANF grant is not going to be as high as what a household living in Northern Virginia will receive. So I've given you an example. This is based on a household of 3. In rural areas, again, like mine, like Nottoway, that are more country, lower cost of living, the maximum grant that a household of 3 would get is $299 a month. In the urban areas, Richmond, Chesterfield, more city-like settings, it's $328 for a household of 3, and then in Northern Virginia, it's $399 a month. So Fairfax, Alexandria, places like that. Because the cost of living is a little bit higher in those areas, there's a $100 difference between somebody that lives in a country-like setting and somebody that lives in Northern Virginia. They just have a little bit more money to meet their needs. And as with the countable income, I did not put in all of the household allotments, but I gave you a link to the chart. This will bring you to the Social Services Manual if you click on it, and then you can look up and see how much the monthly allotment would be in assistance for each household. And again, this example is just based on a household of 3, but the more people in the household, the higher the grant's going to be. And just a note on how the grant is calculated, if the household income if the countable income is less than $10 a month, if the allotment is less than $10 a month after figuring all income, that is, the social services will not issue a TANF payment for that month. But if the person is entitled to more than $10 a month in TANF assistance after all the countable income is configured, then they will get a TANF payment for that month. But I suppose that's only because if the TANF grant is less than $10 a month, it's not even really worth issuing. That takes a lot of paperwork and a lot of manpower to issue those payments, and I suppose Social Services just figures that if they're entitled to less than $10 a month in assistance, it's not even worth processing. So there's different types of income that count when determining the TANF grant for the household. First thing that Social Services is going to look at is any unearned income that comes into the household, and that could be anything like Social Security disability benefits, unemployment benefits, or workers' compensation. And Social Services will take the gross amount of that income, and that will count against the TANF grant if the income is garnished from a third party for child support. So let's say, for example, somebody is on SSDI, but they have $100 a month coming out of their SSDI check for court-ordered child support. Even though that $100 a month is being taken out of the SSDI check, Social Services is still going to count the entire amount of the SSDI that the person gets, even though the $100 a month is being taken out. And that's because there is no provision in the law that would allow them to deduct something like a court-ordered child support. However, if the person has like SSDI or any kind of other benefits like unemployment or workers' comp, and that benefit is being garnished to pay back an overpayment, then Social Services would allow them to deduct that amount. So, for example, if somebody was on SSDI and let's say they were overpaid $50 a month, they were paying back Social Security at a rate of $50 a month, Social Services will count their income at $50 less because they will allow them to deduct for the overpayment that they're paying. So, for example, if the countable unearned income is $1,000 a month in SSDI, but the person's paying an overpayment back at $50 a month, Social Services would only look at it as if they were having $950 come in, not the entire $1,000. Next type of income is earned income, and that's pretty self-explanatory. That's wages and self-employment, vacation and sick time. Social Services will count vacation and sick time as part of that earned income because it is related to employment. So even if the person isn't working, at that time, it still counts because they had to work to accumulate that time. And the way that social services counts earned income is very similar to the way that SSI would. So, for example, earned income is figured using the gross amount that the household has coming in, applying any of those exclusions that I talked about a minute ago, like taking off the 20% of earned income disregard, for example. And then once they apply all those exclusions, they would take the maximum grant amount that the household is entitled to and subtract the countable income from it, and the remainder would be what the TANF grant would be for the month. It's very much like how Social Security does it when determining an SSI check. It's countable income minus 733. The remainder is the SSI check. Works the same way for TANF. And then, similar to SSI also, is deemed income. Social services will look at deemed income if the household has a parent in it, if the child is under 18, or if the person applying for TANF assistance is married, then spouse-to-spouse deeming would apply there too. And I've given you an example of how social services would calculate the deemed income. And this comes from Virginia's TANF manual. So it says Mrs. P is applying for a TANF for herself and her 3 children. So she's looking at applying for TANF for a 4-person household. So Mrs. P receives unearned income of $50 a month, and each of the 3 children receive unearned income of $50 a month as well. So that's $200 a month in unearned income for Mrs. P and her children. Mrs. P's husband is not the child's father. She's remarried, but she is married. So the father is not applying for assistance. He's employed and earns $1,199 per month. All right, so the first thing that they're going to do, because Mrs. P is applying for assistance and has a husband who's working, is determine how much of her husband's income is available to her when calculating that TANF grant. So the first thing they're going to do is determine whether or not Mrs. P can be part of the assistance unit. And this is how they figure that. So they'll take Mr. P's earned income of $1,199, and they don't count the first $90 of that. It's a deeming disregard, spousal deeming disregard. Think of it as an SSI case where Social Security doesn't count the first $85 of wages if the person has no other income. Same thing here, except $90 comes off the countable income right off the top. That leaves a remainder of $1,909 a month in countable income. And then social services will also allow an additional income exclusion here. It's less the standard of assistance for group 2, which is $177. So what that means is that they're looking at her as an assistance unit of 1 because they're looking at her eligibility first. And they don't count the first $177 per month of the earned income of a household consisting of 1 person. And that brings the countable income down to $1,732. Now, in her area, she lives in an urban area like Chesterfield, Richmond. The maximum amount that a 4-person household can get is $392. So to determine whether or not she could be part of the household, Social Security will look at what's countable after all exclusions of the husband's income, which is $1,732. Because that's higher than the maximum standard assistance of $392, she would not be considered as part of that household. Keep going back to the SSI example, but I do it because there's so many similarities. But think of it as you would an SSI case. You know how you go through the SSI budget sheet, apply all the applicable income deductions, and if the income is greater than countable income is greater than 733, then you know that the person is not eligible for SSI for that month. Same thing would apply here. If the countable income is higher than the TANF grant amount after applying all exclusions, then Mrs. P would not be eligible for any assistance for the month. So what social services is going to determine then is that because her income, her countable income is greater than the standard of assistance for a 4-person household, she's not going to be included in the assistance unit. It doesn't mean that the kids won't be eligible for anything. It just means that she won't be part of it, because part of the calculation, because she's married and her husband's working. So once they determine that she's not eligible for assistance, they're going to look at whether or not the kids are. And here's how they do that. First thing they do is take the step parent or Mr. P's income of $1,199 a month, and they look at the 150% of the poverty guidelines for 2. The reason why they look at the poverty guidelines for 2 is because it's a 2-parent household. So what social services will do then is, because 150% of the poverty guidelines for 2 is $1,192, they won't count the $1,192 as part of his wages as available to the children. So really all that's countable that's over the guidelines for a household of 2-parent household is $7. Now, because Mrs. P is not part of the household, instead of looking at a 4-person household, social services is going to determine eligibility based on a 3-person household, which would be the 3 children. And that amount for her area is $328 a month. So they're going to look at the countable income, the assistance unit rather, minus the countable income. And here's how they determine that. They take the $7 that was found to be deemed from Mrs. P's spouse to the children, and add to that the $50 that Mrs. P gets in unearned income, and the $150 that the 3 children get combined. So they determine that out of the $1,199 in earned income, only $7 counts towards determining the TANF grant, and then adds that to the countable income for the household, which would be the unearned income for Mrs. P and the 3 kids. So you add 150 plus the unearned incomes, they got a total of 207 in countable income. And what they would do, very similar to the SSI formula, is take the amount that they would get of 328 if they had no other income, minus countable income from that grant amount, and then the remainder is what's left. In this case, the children would be eligible for a grant of $321 per month. And I'm just going to pause here and look at the chat box. I don't see any questions yet. If you do have any, I will hold on to them and I'll answer them at the end. Wanted to talk a little bit about how the person would be paid if they're determined eligible for TANF assistance. There's a few different methods that they can use to get their payment. One is a Virginia Debit MasterCard, which is a prepaid debit card, very similar to what you would see in certain SSI and SSDI beneficiaries. They have their benefits put on a prepaid card, and then once their money is gone, they can't use it again for the month. Same thing with TANF benefits. The TANF benefits would go electronically on that card. The client could use it until it's gone, and then the card would not be good until the next month. They can do direct deposit to a checking or savings account. So if a client does have a bank account, they can set it up with social services to have their TANF grant direct deposited into like a checking or savings account. or if they don't want to do either of those options, Social Services still will issue a paper check. Social Security doesn't do that anymore. They require the MasterCard or direct deposit, but Social Services still will issue those checks. Okay, I wanted to talk a little bit about what can be and cannot be purchased with TANF funds. So the state has imposed some restrictions on what people can use TANF benefits for. Basically, TANF benefits are to meet the basic needs for food, shelter, and necessities, and not for other types of items. So, for example, they can't use the TANF to buy cigarettes or tobacco, alcohol, or any adult-oriented material. And that's not what the purpose of the funds is. The purpose for the TANF benefits is solely for the use of paying for food, shelter, and other necessities, such as utilities or household products, toilet paper, soap, shampoo, that sort of stuff. Okay, very much like a Social Security case where a client can appeal a decision they don't agree with, a client does also have some appeal rights if they are denied TANF assistance. So first thing you should know is that the Department of Social Services is required to notify every applicant that applies for assistance in writing of their decision, whether it be favorable or unfavorable. So if a client applies and Social Services determines them ineligible for TANF benefits, they have to send that client a letter stating that in writing, with information on how to appeal that denial if they disagree with it. So an appeal request can either be made orally or in writing, and I always recommend that the clients do the appeal in writing. Even though Social Services says they can do it orally, it's always best to have a paper trail to show that when the hearing was requested, because otherwise a person might call up and say, I want a fair hearing, and then they might fall through the cracks. At least if they request a hearing in writing and have a copy of that request, then they can show that they did request a hearing timely if it's ever questioned. In Social Security cases, appeals are usually have to be in within 60 days. In the case of a TANF, they have to appeal a denial of TANF benefits within 30 days. So it has to be within 30 days of the date they got a letter saying that they were denied for assistance. They would have to file the request for a hearing. Otherwise, if they wait longer than 30 days without a good cause, Social Services may deny the request for a hearing and make them apply again. So I've given you some examples of what constitutes a hearing, when would be appropriate for a client to request one. One would be the denial of TANF assistance if Social Security or Social Services says they're denied and they want to appeal that. That would be a reason to appeal it. Delay in timely process of the application. Social Services is supposed to respond to every request for assistance within 45 days. Sometimes if it's an emergency, like if a household is homeless or without food, they would have to respond sooner than that, usually like within 10 days in an emergency case. But an average processing for TANF assistance is 45 days. So if a person has applied, let's say 3 months ago, and they never got a decision, then that would be an example of a time to file an appeal and say, well, I applied 3 months ago. I was told that I was going to get an answer in 45 days. I haven't heard anything. They can fill out the request and request a hearing due to the lack of processing the application within a reasonable amount of time. And then if they disagree with the decision to stop or reduce TANF benefits, if somebody's on TANF benefits already and they get a letter saying, well, your benefits are going to be reduced and stopped, then they can go ahead and appeal that as well. And I've given you an example of an appeal form, and because the appeal form is not that long, I will just go through it with you. Very simple. This is just the name of the client, the case number, the county, city they live in, their address, city, state, zip. The next section is asking for information on which benefit they're appealing. There's no separate appeal forms for different kind of benefits. All the benefits are appealed for using the same form. So it asks, are you appealing a decision on your TANF, on your SNAP food stamps, on your auxiliary grant, on your heat benefits? And then it just says, I request a review of the proposed action to the Department of Social Services in the county or city of, and they would just put the county that they live in for the reasons checked below. And then there's some different options. I want to appeal because they refuse to take my application, or I want to appeal because I've been told that I'm ineligible for services and I don't agree with that. Or I got a letter saying that I'm no longer eligible for food stamps. I wanted to appeal that. So the person would just check the appropriate box stating the reason for the appeal. And if none of the options are there, there's a little space underneath where the client can state what the issue is with their benefits and why they want to appeal it. And then it just says, I understand that any assistance or benefits received until a hearing decision is given must be repaid to the agency if the hearing supports the decision. So, in other words, social services can pay benefits while the appeal is being processed. If somebody applies for TANF and does not get it, for example, but says, I want to appeal that, they might be able to get TANF benefits in the interim when the hearing is being processed. But once they have the hearing, if the hearing upholds the original decisions and says, well, we find that you weren't eligible for any TANF benefits all along, then any benefits they would have got during the appeal would have to be repaid. And then it asks, would you like your benefits to continue during the appeal? And they don't have to say yes. If they say no, then they don't owe anything, obviously, if the decision is upheld. And then they just sign it and date it and take it to their local social services office. And that's the appeal procedure if somebody wants to disagree with their decision. I want to talk a little bit about time limits on assistance. Unlike Social Security, that can continue until the person is either medically improved or earning over the SSI threshold, or maybe SGA in an SSDI case. TANF works a little bit differently. There's time limits on TANF assistance, and it depends on a few different factors too that I'll go through in a minute. So in addition to increases in income impacting TANF, there's a time limit on that assistance, and that limit is 60 months. If an adult member of the household has received TANF assistance, or if a child has been receiving TANF assistance as part of an eligible household, the parent must participate in the VIEW program, which I'll explain in a little bit, and eligibility for TANF will end after a maximum of 60 months. So the household cannot receive TANF benefits for more than 5 years. And that's not a continuous clock necessarily. The 60 months only run in a month where a TANF payment is issued to the household. So any month where they get a TANF payment counts as 1 month towards that clock. But let's say, for example, somebody received TANF for 6 months, went to work for a little bit, didn't get a check for 2 months. Those 2 months that they didn't get a check wouldn't count towards their 60 months. It's only months where they actually got a TANF benefit. And the TANF time limits apply to most households, but it doesn't apply to all households. There are a few exceptions where households can get benefits for longer than 60 months. One is if the parent or which they define as the caretaker on record in the case, if there's children in the household, or for two parents in the TANF household, if there's two of them, both must be certified physically or mentally disabled by a physician showing that the client is incapable of working more than 20 hours a week. So, for example, if somebody was certified as disabled by Social Security and they have children in the household, their children may be able to get benefits for longer than 60 months because the parents are disabled and incapable of self-support at the time. Or if the person, the head of household, maybe not be disabled, but there might be a member of the household that is permanently disabled, and the household, the head of household is like a caretaker for that person. So if, for example, a mother applies and has a son in the household that's also receiving TANF assistance, if that son is disabled and the mother is the primary caretaker, then the mother could potentially get benefits for longer than 60 months because the son is not capable of self-support. And so they made a little bit note in the manual to it, though. It says if the person without a disability spends most of the day outside of the home, or if the caretaker works outside of the home, they will not be considered a caretaker for TANF assistance and will not qualify for the exception. So basically what that means is that the mom might be able to get payments for longer than 60 months if they're a caretaker for their disabled child, for example, but the mom would have to stay home a majority of the time with that child. You know, she couldn't go out and get a job or be outside the household for prolonged periods of time in order to qualify for that exception. And wanted to talk lastly about the Virginia Initiative for Employment Net Welfare, or VIEW program. And this is something that's required of all applicants that have applied for services and have children older than 1 year old in the household, where they are required to participate in some sort of job training, job placement program that social services will link them up with, which could include helping them get into a GED program if they don't have a high school diploma, linking them up with college resources, on-the-job training. If a person in the household is disabled, though, they are not required to do the VIEW program because of their disability. They are exempt from that. But otherwise, if the person does not have a disability and they have children older than 1, they would be required to be linked up with the VIEW program and expected to either attend school, like a GED program if they don't have their education, an on-the-job training program, a volunteer program in a community organization. They have to do more than just sit home and collect the TANF benefits. One of the conditions for approval of the TANF is that if the household members that can work do not meet the exceptions, then they are required to do that. And part of it could even be linking up the client to DARS if they have a disability and they're looking for job training, job placement, assistance with tuition. That would be an appropriate link as well. Social services might say to Joe Smith, okay, well, you say you have a disability, you should go to vocational rehabilitation. They might be able to help you find work. That would be a suitable example of somebody complying with the VIEW requirement program. And so individuals who are in the paid program can make up to the federal poverty level for their household size and still be eligible for TANF. And then individuals participating in the program can receive TANF payments for 24 months. So they can get TANF payments for 2 years while they work. And then social services require them to take a 24-month break so they can be 2 years on TANF assistance, 2 years off, and then apply again if they meet all the requirements. But in any case, no household, unless they are members with disabilities, would be eligible for getting TANF payments for longer than 60 months. And in most cases, if a client is disabled and is on TANF for longer than 60 months, although that technically, they technically would not be terminated from TANF just because they've been on benefits for longer than 60 months, social services may say to them, okay, well, we think you should go apply for SSI or SSDI, and encourage them to follow up with a application with Social Security benefits, and then they would convert from TANF to SSI, for example, if they're found approved. So social services is more than likely going to encourage households with applicants who are disabled to apply for those Social Security benefits. They don't want any household to remain on TANF indefinitely. All right, so I've been talking for about 45 minutes. We have 15 minutes left. I'm going to open it up to questions. I know I kind of threw a lot of information at you. There was a lot to cover in a short amount of time. You guys are in listen-only mode because this is a webinar. So if you do have a question, you can type it in the chat box, though, or in the question box, and I'd be glad to answer it. Any questions, concerns, comments about any of the material that I covered so far? Okay, and I'm not seeing any, and it doesn't look like anybody is typing. Since we have a few more minutes, maybe what I'll do is pull up the paper version of the application and just go through some of the general questions just to give you an idea of what that looks like. So give me a moment and I'll scroll back up to the top and we'll open up that application again. I'm not going to do Common Help because that would start a new application for assistance. We'll just look at the paper one. The paper copy is just it mirrors what is on the website. So all the questions that Common Help would ask if a person was to apply online would also appear on this paper copy. So as you can see on the application for benefits, there's no separate applications for different services. They use one application for different benefits. You can use this to apply for Social Security's auxiliary grant, SNAP benefits, which is food stamps, TANF, general relief, emergency assistance. And this just says that if you need help completing this application, have somebody help you, or the eligibility worker can help you. And that brings another point up that I almost forgot to mention, but when taking applications for like temporary assistance or SNAP benefits, social services is required to provide reasonable accommodations for clients that are applying, and ensure that those applications are processed timely. So an example of a reasonable accommodation would be if somebody had a learning disability and they couldn't complete the application on their own because of that, they could go to the eligibility worker and say, I want to apply for assistance, can you help me? And then the eligibility worker would be required to fill out the application with the client. Or another example would be if social services wanted somebody to come in for an interview and the person used a wheelchair and they couldn't either get out of the house or get to the office. An example of reasonable accommodation in that case would be maybe a telephone interview rather than requiring the person to do face-to-face. So the first section just talks about how social services is required to provide those kind of accommodations if they're requested. And then it just says that the client is required to provide information to the best of their ability. Basically not commit fraud. There could be penalties for clients who provide false information. And it talks about how the application must be filled out fully and completely in order for the eligibility for services to be determined. If there's any missing information, that's going to delay the processing of the application. And then any information that is provided to Social Security might be matched with like what the DMV has on record, the Employment Commission, just to verify like the names and the Social Security numbers that people put on the application is accurate and correct, and they're not using a false name or anything like that. Next section just talks about, how they don't discriminate based on disability, age, sex. Everybody is entitled to file for assistance, and social services is required to take an application from everyone. And then the next section just talks about instructions for completing the application. So the first section is just applicant information, name, address, telephone number, social security number, household compositions for everybody living in your home, even if they're not applying. So they're asking for, like if the person's married, if the person has a spouse that's working, how much does the spouse make? Is there any unearned income coming into the household? Even if the person is not applying that receives the income, they still have to be considered as part of the household size. Next section talks about income. Social services is going to ask for any documentation of wages the person might receive or unearned income like SSI, SSDI, and ask for documentation in the form of pay stubs or if the person's on Social Security benefits, a letter from Social Security showing what they receive, or maybe a BPQI that would verify that amount. They would be required to provide that. Next section talks about resources, and resources are kind of outdated. There's an income limit for TANF assistance, but there is no resource limit anymore. That was changed a while back. But resources still do apply for other programs such as TANF. And then there's a section on page 9 that talks about the penalties for providing false information to social services. You guys can read that on your own. I'm not going to go through that. But then, there's a section like if somebody's applying for SNAP benefits, and they're saying, well, I have no income, I have no food in my household, they can apply for expedited SNAP, and within 7 days of that application, a decision will have to be made. They can expedite it just based on the fact that it's an emergency, and we'll talk about SNAP a little bit more in that training next week. Voter registration, if they're not registered to vote, they can register to vote by using the application. And then there's a section for agency use only, basically asking if the information provided is complete, do they have verification of income, do they have any special circumstances that would necessitate an emergency where the case would have to be processed quicker. And then the application begins. Like I said, applicant information, name, address, phone number. We'll ask about income, SSI, SSDI wages, and so forth. That's just a brief overview of the application. Okay, and looks like I have one question. What is the email again for the contact at Cornell to gain access for logging in the continuing education? Lauren, that is Michelle Elvord, and her email address is M as in Mary, S as in Sam, A as in Apple, and I believe it's 224 at cornell.edu. And she can kind of walk you through the process of accessing your Cornell portal and logging in those credits. And like I said earlier, it would just be my name, the name of the session, and the duration, which was an hour. And you should be able to receive credit for that. I worked that out with Ray a while back where he was okay with you guys getting credit for any of the webinars that I do. And for anybody that's listening to this via recording, that would also apply to you, because if you're taking the time to listen to this, it's just the same as attending it live. So if you're taking the time to listen to the archive, go ahead and take the time to log in those credits. Okay. Any other last questions, concerns, or comments on the TANF material? All right then. If not, the next webinar on SNAP benefits is going to be held a week from today, same time, 1 to 2, and I sent an email out with the TANF registration link and the TANF handout as well, so you guys should all have that. And that session will be recorded as well in the event that you can't attend. And then I'm also going to be doing some additional webinars on additional state benefits, like I said in the beginning, throughout the spring, summer, and fall. I don't have all the topics picked out yet or the dates, but stay tuned. I will get that information to you as soon as possible. But I believe the one after SNAP that I want to do is going to be in June on the relationship between 1619B Medicaid and Medicaid Works. Not all providers know that clients can potentially qualify for both 1619B and Medicaid Works, and not all VR counselors are aware of that either, so I think that would be a really valuable one for you guys to attend. So that'll probably be sometime in June, and then I'll get a calendar to you with all the rest of the training dates and topics as soon as I have it pulled together. All right, well, thank you for your time and attendance and participation today. Have a great rest of the day, everyone. Bye-bye.